You were listening to the Living Room Disciple Podcast. We aim to model the discipleship conversations that should be happening on couches and around dining room tables. We're trying to grow our imaginations to think about what could and should be as we follow Jesus. We're asking ourselves questions about how we're being formed more or less like Jesus by the world around us. And we invite you into that conversation. So if you find this episode helpful, make sure to share it with a friend. Also, liking and subscribing, leaving a review, all those things help us grow and get the word out there. So please be sure to do that as well.
Today we are talking about prophets. What is a biblical prophet and what does it look like to be a prophet in 2024? How does the Lord still choose to speak through people and what does it look like to do that faithfully within community even when it costs us something? Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Living Room Disciple Podcast, where discipleship finds a home.
Okay, so I did one of those like spiritual gift testy things.
Nice.
I know, right? Right?
Are you even a Christian if you haven't?
Honestly, at least not in America. But it was like a specific one. Like it wasn't all the different, like I don't know. I feel like I see some and they throw like business acumen on there. It's like a spiritual gift,
Nice.
It just
I did not read Paul's passage on business acumen.
Yeah. Seriously, I did one that told me I had the spiritual gift of craftsmanship, and it was because I like doing house projects. Anyways, that's not a thing. But this one was all geared towards the fivefold ministry. And so it was questions. If for those of you who haven't done one of these, they're on par like a personality test questionnaire type thing. And we may knock them. I do actually think there's value in self-reflection and in talking about them in community. I'm just be a little silly. But anyways, the fivefold ministry, is Paul writes about it. And he says that some have been given the gift of apostleship. I'm going to get this out of order. I always get it out of order. Apostleship, evangelism, teaching, prophet, and pastor. Right. So they're the five. I think of them as the five roles: the role of apostle, the role of prophet, the role of evangelist, the role of teacher, the role of pastor. And so this is a little like, take all these little questions, and then you got to put your email in because
obviously
your
credit card information.
Yeah, right. Social, and then they email you, your responses, and it was cool. And I came back. Guess.
Ooh, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like
me?
I feel like the low-hanging fruit is
friendship test
is teaching, because you were literally a teacher for years and years, and still kind of are. Yeah,
I always score low on teaching, or not low, but like lower. Yeah.
What was it?
Apostle.
Wow.
I'm like, I don't even know what my theological belief is on the apostle. Like,
what does it mean to be an apostle in 2024?
But a close second, because it's percentages. So I think it was 74% apostle, but a close second was prophet.
Awesome.
And you know what I said? I don't have the beard for that. That's a Nick O'Brien role.
Ooh, I don't think I have a prophet beard either.
Yeah, but in all seriousness, it did get me thinking. And the team or the individual put together this, I think really had good heart, good intention, and not really gaining anything other than me on their email list. Trying to help people process through, if they have a gifting in the fivefold ministry, and if so, how are we using that for the church? So I think that there's a lot of value, and it's really cool. But it did get me thinking about like this whole idea of what does it mean to be a prophet in the 2024 American church? Because I feel like for us, like we joked about apostle, like these roles, we have a mental image of what a pastor is. I'm not sure it aligns with what Paul was talking about, but we have a mental image of a pastor, and we kind of use that as like the everything bucket. I think we make some room for evangelists, but I think in recent modern memory, that's very fringe and not very attractive. Like we have a lot of connotations that go with even that evangelist.
Or it takes an arena with like a BMX show and a Christian band concert and Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we make some room for evangelists, but essentially we just put pastor and teacher into one category,
Yeah.
and that's what church leadership looks like. And so I really have been thinking a little bit about like, what does it mean to be in the role of prophet, to have the gift of
Hmm.
prophecy in the Western church? I think we should talk about it.
Let's do it.
All
Yeah, and
right.
I think it applies to what we've been talking about in this political season, because I think our bend towards democracy, the the fact that we all have a voice, sometimes might lead us to really want to believe that our voice might be um, need to be more significant than it is, says the guy who's
Mm-hmm.
co-hosting a podcast.
Yeah, dude,
And
I know, man. I have so many moments of self-reflection. Like, anyways,
yeah,
go on.
yeah, for real. Um, and so a prophet, we should maybe start with definitions of what was a prophet in the Old Testament and even the New Testament.
Yeah.
Um, and a prophet was somebody who spoke on behalf of God.
Mm-hmm.
So was a reflection of God to the people of Israel
Mm-hmm.
or Judah. Um, and also could be a reflection of the people back to God, would bring the
Mm-hmm.
people's requests back to God. So kind of worked as a mediator between God and humanity, and specifically
Mm-hmm.
his chosen nation. Um,
Separate from the priesthood.
yes, yes,
Yeah, which actually is really important because there is a level of intercessory communication that we see in the prophets, but it's
right,
I mean, I might disagree with you a little bit, not fully, but it's mostly God speaking through prophet to the people with
yeah,
moments of the prophet pleading on behalf of the people, but usually not. It usually wasn't the people saying, please plead for us. There was a few
right.
moments, but generally it was just,
It was usually the prophet being heartbroken for the people and then
hmm
praying on their behalf,
they
whether they
should be
wanted it or not.
repenting, and I'm repenting on
Exactly.
their behalf. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm wearing sackcloth and ashes for them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Hmm.
exactly. And so I think I probably don't know enough about the ancient culture of Israel and Judah to say this, but my hunch is that there weren't a lot of people that would have felt called to speak prophetically. Think about
Mm-hmm,
a culture that's very agrarian, that is not a democracy in any way, shape, or form, that you
hmm,
don't have a
hmm.
voice in the way politics works in your civilization. And you mostly just you wake up every day, you do the work you have to do, you do with your family what you have to do, you go to bed and you start all over again. And of course
Hmm.
there's time meditating in the word, and there's obviously religious practices and going to the temple and whatnot, but I think in general the average person probably isn't concerned about being a prophetic voice for the Lord.
Yeah,
Whereas today in the United States, where we all have a social media account, where we have our brand represented online, where anybody can find us, and we all are drilled into us that the most important thing about our identity might be our beliefs about politics or religion, or where do you stand on this issue or that issue. We have this idea that our voice really matters because we have to go out and vote and make your voice heard. And so I
yeah,
think that the tendency for the average person in America, as opposed to ancient Israel or Judah, is probably more towards I ought to speak like a prophet. Whereas the average person, in the context of the actual prophets in ancient times, probably would have looked at them like, why in the world are you sticking your neck out like that? Why would you do that? What does it benefit
yeah,
you to speak out like that? Whereas I can try to gain social points and social status by speaking out in the right way to earn points with the right team, right? And I think it's a very different culture, and we have to think carefully about if we want to play the role of the prophet, if we want to speak, is it costing us anything? Is my question that I think we need to come back to.
and I love that question because we do have some examples through the Old Testament of prophets who stand in opposition to the prophet, right? So there's
Yeah.
moments, for example, like Elijah, and there's these other prophets that I think King Jeroboam, but anyways, are like listening to, right? So they're and God speaks a lot through the prophet to those other prophets,
Right.
calling them false prophets, and so
Interesting.
because it would appear from the perspective of these writers that these prophets were gaining favor with the king and saying what the king wanted to hear, and this happened periodically in order to gain favor. Um, and I think what's interesting is I'm trying to remember who talked about this at nauseum. Um, but I think maybe it was Tim Mackey in the Bible Project's series on how to read the Bible, but I might be getting that wrong. So correct me, Nick. But I heard it said last year that in many ways, many of the Old Testament prophetic books were the Minority Report. They
Yeah.
were, yeah, like these were people on the fringes, and they were adopted eventually into canon because their words lasted the ages. You know what I mean? Like they were proved true.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the other prophets of the time who maybe were popular and their writings were more widely read were over time proved untrue.
Right.
Actually, this is from Deuteronomy, and this is probably the most foundational text on this. So, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15 kind of on starts talking about prophets, and there's a prophecy given
Imagine that.
about one day there's going to be a prophet that is raised up. And here, I'll just read it from 15 on. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me. This is Moses speaking to people from your countrymen. To him you shall listen. I think this is a foreshadowing text for Jesus, but immediately this is fulfilled in Joshua. This is in accordance with everything that you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, do not let me hear the voice of the Lord my God again, and do not let me see this great fire anymore, or I will die. And so Moses is saying the fulfillment of the people wanting some distance between them and Yahweh is the need for this prophet. And so Moses fulfills the role in some ways of a first prophet. Abraham kind of fills that too, but Moses, I think, kind of has this more formalized role pretty early on. And then Joshua picks that up, and then eventually we get others who come down the line. And the Lord said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up for them a prophet from among the countrymen like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them everything that I command him. And it shall come about that whoever does not listen to my words, which he speaks in my name, I myself will require it of him. But the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, a word which I have not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. And if you say in your heart, how will you recognize the word which the Lord has not spoken? Well, when the prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, and the thing does not happen or come true, well, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. It's really, I appreciate the lack of complexity.
Yeah.
The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You are not to be afraid of him. That's Deuteronomy again, chapter 18, 15 through 22. And I was reading from the New American Standard. I'll pause there. Thoughts?
I mean, what other message would a modern day prophet need to hear other than that? If what you're saying isn't coming true time and time and time and time and time again, it's probably the case that the Lord is not speaking through you. And I'm thinking of, your YouTube prophets.
Yeah. Which comes to mind, I think that's actually maybe one of the reasons I wanted, when I think of prophet, it sounds so dumb, but when I think of like modern day prophet, the first thing I think of is clickbaity YouTube things,
Right.
which
Right.
for the record, I hope we will never be accused of, but I
Yeah.
fully acknowledge that we're a YouTube podcast. And so, maybe we would be, and I would understand that criticism. But
So
that's what
what's your
comes to mind.
prediction? Oh, no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. But I honestly don't even think about it in prediction, maybe because that's not what my algorithm throws at me.
Right.
I get on to the Living Room Disciple videos and I try to watch them and, like support our channel, right? Because that's what I do. I care about this. And so I get other kind of like podcast recommendations in my YouTube feed. And it's a lot. There'll be a lot of thumbnaily things. I'm not much of like a YouTube watcher, so I don't actually click on these videos. So I'm speaking with some ignorance. But like the clickbaity thumbnaily thing is usually like, is Stephen Furtick like
Right.
a false teacher, or
Right.
is Francis Chan, become woke, or I don't know, like whatever
Right.
else. A question that is laced with insinuation that the poster of that video is insinuating they have the authority to indicate the false or truth teaching of you. It's always famous individuals, because
Right.
we'll get to that. But I don't know, it just smacks of arrogance to me, and that this is not what being a prophet in 24 is supposed to be. But it raises a lot of questions like, so if a prophet in the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant, is an individual who's supposed to kind of operate from that heart of the people don't want to be close to Yahweh. And so we need these voices, right? As part of the priesthood, there are these individuals who are going to be the voice. We're going to speak the words of Yahweh to the people when the people are not otherwise listening.
Hmm.
And they will personify the repentant heart, and in some way, say, shape or form, kind of like embody the true Israel that has not walked away from God. And that's kind of how like these prophets seem to operate.
Yeah.
And then we get to the new covenant, right? The prophet that's, I think, being prophesied in that moment shows up, in the person of Jesus, and the Lord raises him up, and he speaks, and he lives, and he dies. This is the story of the gospel, right? And he's resurrected, and then he sends the Spirit to come, and it would appear, amongst many other things, to give us giftings, in which these giftings can be used to serve the body and live out a kingdom that is not yet here, the already not yet kingdom, right? So I can begin fulfilling the new kingdom life through some of those spiritual giftings that I've been given. And some of these giftings have a clear target, the equipping of the saints to do ministry. So some giftings are not to equip saints to do ministry, they're to do the ministry. But some, they're going to be the servers of the servers. And to serve them well, they need to be given special gifts that help disciple others into that ministry mindset and life. And those are the fivefold ministry. And one of those is prophet. Now, in this context, what does it mean to be
Hmm.
a prophet? What does it mean to eh, to speak God's word now? And I think I'm trailing off here, but you hear I'm going with this, Nick. Like, I think this is, I
Yeah.
don't really know what the answer is here.
Yeah.
I have thoughts, but I'm wrestling with what does that mean, especially because it doesn't feel as clear cut as in Deuteronomy. Like, a
Right.
lot of the prophetic words aren't things we're going to see come to pass or not come to pass.
Right.
You remember with that?
Yeah. Are you saying in Ephesians that prophecy is a gift given to serve the servers?
The role of prophet is a role that's meant to equip the servers to do service.
Right. Yeah. So I think it can be really easy to kind of take the pop culture idea of modern day prophet and kind of have this idea of fortune telling, future seeing, um, words from God about who is and isn't a false teacher.
Hmm.
Um, it can be easy to get into those things and be formed into believing A, my voice is more important than other voices, and B, that my job is to predict people's demise or predict
Yeah.
or call out false teachers that I've never met, or it's often not linked in something we talk about on this podcast all the time, relationship, which I would
Mm-hmm,
say that the
hmm.
prophets in the Old Testament are specifically called to their people to give God's words to their people that they are in community with.
Yeah.
It's I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there's a time where a prophet from Israel is called to Judah, or a prophet from Judah is called to Israel, or something like that. Jonah is called to Nineveh, I guess. But in general, I think the
Hmm.
prophets are called to their own people who they are in
Hmm.
relationship with and who they stand to lose social capital with when they stick their necks out and say, you guys are royally messing this up and God has some thoughts. And
Hmm.
we
Hmm.
generally, we might speak of prophetic courage, and then we stand up and we rail against people that our tribe already doesn't like. Whereas we are generally
Yeah.
very slow to criticize people that are on our team, even if they act the same way as the people we're criticizing on the other team. And so I would just, if you are excited to speak prophetically, that doesn't alone mean that those words are not from God. But in general, if you read through the prophets in the Old Testament, it's rare that they are excited to share the message that they are burdened to share.
Yeah.
It's a heavy calling and responsibility.
No, I'm tracking with that. And I do think it's worth highlighting what you said too, that there's not the books of the prophets and from the Hebrew Bible do contain prophecy, but that is to put that in a bucket of futurism is
Yeah.
far too narrow a bucket. Sometimes it does have implications for what is to come, but sometimes it's actually talking about the past, or using the past to give analogy for the present. It's just more
Mm-hmm.
complicated than that. And sometimes it's like accidentally futuristic, like they're talking about a particular thing then, but it turns into a messianic prophecy. Not accidentally. That's not what I meant. I didn't mean
I
like
know
an
what you mean.
accident, but like
Yeah.
they had a target audience in mind that was alive right then and there in front of them.
I think the thumbnail on this YouTube video will be, "Is Phil a false teacher?" Because he said that the Bible is an accident.
Yeah, right. Is Phil a false prophet? But I think I will say there's one element that I feel like is missing from what you just said, though, with it
Yeah.
being in community, and I think that for the record, I agree. But I heard it said once, and I want to know your thoughts on it because I don't really know where I land. Oftentimes, the prophet's role is to speak truth unto power.
Hmm.
And I think that is very true in the Hebrew Bible, especially. But I also think because that's their target audience is almost always the kings, the priests of
Right.
the day.
Right.
They would say, like there'd be general sometimes to the masses, but usually it was to the power structures. It'd be, and I think we don't have as many clear examples in the New Testament scriptures. But I do think, and these people are not identified specifically as prophets. So this is me reading into things, and I want your thoughts. But I do think of John the Baptist,
Mm-hmm.
who speaks out
For sure.
to Herod, who is identifying with Jewish customs,
And he's
calls
compared
out
to
his
Elijah.
yeah, and he was compared to the spirit of Elijah. So I think of John the Baptist, speaks truth and power. He also had some confrontational moments with the Pharisees. I think of Jesus, who speaks. His harsh words are, correct me if I'm wrong, are exclusively reserved for the power structures that be.
And specifically religious power structures. He
Religious power
doesn't ever
structures that
call
be.
out Caesar that I'm aware of.
No, I do think he calls out Herod though. Again,
That's fair.
so he kind of joins. This is like this is a terrible podcast host moment, by the way. I'm like adjusting my light. Like this is like I feel like I'm in like a meeting at work. Not, anyways.
Yeah.
And then I think about moments like Paul calling out Peter,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like it's not used, but this feels like a prophet moment, because there's a very legitimate argument to be like, dude, who are you, Paul? Like, you are an evangelist on the outskirts of Christendom, and you kind of should just be lucky that you're even here because you're kind of a big fat jerk at the beginning of all this. All right, you don't deserve to like speak to Peter, who walked with Jesus. You know what I mean? Who appointed Stephen to the role before you murdered him or oversaw his murder. So they kind of, in my opinion, should be the dynamic, but the dynamic isn't that. Like Paul's like, this is wrong, and he's going to speak to even the church power structure at that time. And then, should be noted, Peter's response is unlike almost anybody in the Hebrew Bible, where he's like, "You're right," and he repents, which is just an amazing. That was one of the most redeeming, beautiful things that I think Peter's story arc has. But anyways. But I think about that, I think about John, whether we don't know which John is the individual who's used to write the revelation of Jesus. But, in the book of Revelation, John is used to speak through the Spirit speaks through him to these 7 churches. And at least 5 of those churches, he had some pretty difficult words. And in my mind, they're aimed to the church in general, but there's elders of these churches, there's leaders of these churches that I think the words are most stinging for. So, should we have that? Like, not just in communities, but individuals who, can get up on a stage, who can hop on a YouTube video and who can rightfully call out, the leaders of, large Christian institutions, of large churches. These are our equivalents of power
Right.
structures in Western Christendom.
Yeah.
Whether that's the Pope, or whether that's Stephen Furtick, or I don't know other mega church pastors off the top. I'm really bad at this.
Either the Pope or Stephen Furtick.
Yeah. So yeah, is Rick Warren still a thing?
Yeah.
He's still doing stuff, right?
I don't think he's a senior pastor anymore, but he's still around.
Okay, but you get where I'm going with this, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can that still be a thing?
I think these kind of two side conversations we're having here really merge together. Because my point is prophecy should be in community and it should cost you something. Your point is prophecy calls out to power and power structures. And I think what happens too often is we think I'm called to speak out prophetically and maintain the purity of the gospel. And so we hop on YouTube and we call out Rick Warren and Francis Chan and Stephen Furtick and all these guys, or the Pope, or we call out the president or this senator, or we call out people that we have no way of meeting, that we lose nothing if we call them out, that nothing is going to happen to it, right? It's people that cost us nothing to call out. What, anecdotally speaking, what I think rarely happens is somebody notices their pastor of their church missteps, and they don't just go to lunch and complain about it with their little group of friends. They actually go to their pastor and have a conversation about it, or they actually call the church to hold the pastor accountable, or the pastor is actually forced to leave the ministry because if it's a large enough issue. I think what can too easily happen is people on top of smaller power structures can fly under the radar because nobody is willing to say the hard thing when it's going to cost them socially. Because you don't just call out your pastor of your church where you're in community with and leave unscathed, right?
Yeah.
And so that's going to cost you something, and it happens in community. It's easy to call out Francis Chan or Rick Warren or Stephen Furtick or whoever. And sometimes that is probably necessary too. But I think if we are thinking of ourselves as having that role of prophet, I just wonder if we are willing to stretch that beyond just calling out large national figures.
Yeah.
And are we willing to be courageous enough to maintain that same role of prophet when it costs us something relationally?
Okay, so quick story. Me and my wife have 4 kids, and as you can imagine, it's kind of difficult for us to find time to read the Word together. And so I was pretty interested when a little over a year ago, a mentor of mine told me about the Dwell Bible app, an app that really contains some of the most beautiful audio Bibles you'll ever hear. So we checked it out and started a new habit, listening to the Psalms at night before going to bed. But the best part is we set it up so it would read the same psalm over and over to us, but in a different translation and in a different voice. Voices that were diverse and reminds me of the crazy diversity and multiculturalism that is the church. That the Bible and the story of Scripture goes far beyond my cultural bounds. And it's not just the Bible. There's also daily readings where you can, on your drive to work, listen to the Dwell Daily and get into the Word every single day. All right, so for more information and to get a special discount code for being a Living Room Disciple podcast listener, head on over to dwellbible.com/TLRD. That's dwellbible.com/TLRD. You can find out more information about the Dwell Bible app, and you can get plugged in with a special discount code so you and your family can get started on listening to the Bible and all these different wonderful voices and get more connected and soaked in the Word. Okay, back to the episode. Okay, so to recap, and I really appreciate this, there is still that element where a prophet's role is to speak truth under power to these power structures. But they're the local power structures. They're the power structures that you have intimacy with. And, when you said that, when you were speaking, it did make me think most of these prophets, I don't think all of them, but most of these prophets ended up in the king's throne room. You know what I mean? Did they have throne rooms?
I think so.
Something like that.
We're going with throne room.
The equivalent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. But they ended up in the presence, because that's where the Lord wanted them to be and to do. And then Paul stands before Peter, and so on and so forth. I'm sure there's exceptions. Even the letters, though, are usually built upon a past intimacy and knowledge of.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm tracking with that we should be, and I want to talk about how we know if we have the gift or the calling.
Right.
So we're coming to that. But if, we're called into the role of prophet, the default, there's probably exceptions. I don't want to put this limits on the Spirit, but I think default, the question should be, are we being called to speak truth to the local power structures of our Christian community for the good of the church through the equipping of the saints to do ministry, right? The end goal is that those in the church are better equipped to minister to the community, to love their neighbor well, to live out the new kingdom ethic in this life today. Okay, so I think I'm tracking with that, and I'm really appreciative of that. I think that's really, really helpful for me. But now this is totally anecdotal, okay? Which I guess most of my examples tonight have been anecdotal, but here we are. Fully anecdotally, the people that I feel like want to take on that role to call out the pastor or whatever, I think the people who identify as prophets feel like non-prophets to me. Like, yeah, right. I don't know how to. I'm trying to say this in like a way that's not rude, but I sometimes I feel like people are arrogant, not prophetic.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like,
I have been that person.
I was just about to say that. Why are we running a podcast?
Because we're better now.
Yeah, right. We have no, but like most of my better is just realizing I'm an idiot. You know what I mean? And just like, Lord, help me. Oh my gosh.
Humility. Yeah. In 5 years from now, we'll realize.
Oh my gosh, I'm not watching
how far off we were. Yeah, for
real. But no, in all seriousness, like I just don't. I feel like the Phil of my early 20s, who felt like I like the Lord must have been telling me to run my mouth. Like I felt that. Like I really genuinely thought there were moments in my life that I was supposed to speak up, and maybe I was.
Yeah.
But when I say the results weren't what they should be, I don't mean that like people, not everyone repents when a prophet speaks. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about my heart condition didn't become closer to God and didn't look like Jesus at the end, right?
Right.
I became more full of myself. I became more locked into the conviction that I was right. I was less inclined to go to scripture and less inclined to listen to others' correction. You know what I mean? Like, it's just the opposite of becoming more like Jesus in this life. And so that's where I know, like, even if what I said was right, my heart was so far off, I was more pharisaical. So I'm not sure that in the past I've had that calling, and despite this test that I've taken, I'm not convinced that that's the role I'm supposed to be playing in the church. Maybe it is. So what's your 2 cents? Like, how does somebody know?
Man, this might sound really trite, but I think there's a degree to which, if you're going to claim to speak prophetically for God, you should know that God called you to speak prophetically for God, right? If you're able to say the words that God told you to say, you should also be able to know God put this in me. And so if that is not there, that probably means whatever God told you to say also wasn't from God if he didn't first tell you, right? What do you think? Does that make sense to you? Is that too simple?
I think it might be too simple. And the only reason I say that is because I feel like I know so many people who are like, yeah, the Lord told me that. And I'm sitting over here, I don't think he did. Like,
right.
So I guess that's the thing. I'm not worried about someone knowing in their mind, being convicted, you know what I mean? In their heart. What I'm saying is, like, I think me and you have both experienced enough people who really do believe that the Lord has told them something.
Mm-hmm.
Here, let me run over to, is it First John? Yeah, the testing of the spirits. First John, chapter 4. Don't believe every spirit,
Mm-hmm.
but test the spirits, see whether they're from God. John takes quite a bit of time to talk about antichrist and false prophets, by the way. So, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not uh, confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming and now is already in the world. You are from God, little children, and have overcome them, because greater is he who is in you than is in the world. They are from the world, therefore they speak as from the world. The world listens to them. We are from God. The one who knows God listens to us. The one who is not from God does not listen to us. By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. Here's why I read that. There was a time in which I'd read that in First John, and I'd immediately start thinking about testing everybody else's word to me, testing every celebrity teaching I heard. And that's good. Like, that's actually not wrong. What I'm trying to say is I wouldn't test that inner voice in my imagination where I really feel like I'm hearing from the Lord. And I had to learn to start testing that, to, especially for an extended season in my mid to later 20s, testing, like, Lord, is that you? I need to know that's you. Like, I'm not moving until I know that you are the one who said that.
Mm-hmm.
Lord, I'm not going to say that until I know that you're the one that said that. And taking a season of my life to push against that inner voice long enough to start building up that discernment.
Yeah.
And I didn't have that in my early 20s. In my early 20s, I didn't push it. Anything that came to mind, I just assumed was from God, essentially. And I just ran my mouth. And I hurt a lot of people. I didn't do what literally the next verse in First John is, verse 7, 1 John 4, verse 7. Let's love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. I did not use my words to love, and so I ended up causing a lot of hurt. And it wasn't until I started to realize that I started testing the spirit inside of me.
Yeah.
And then through that testing, kind of being discerned, like, oh, like that's my flesh, dude. Like, that's not.
Yeah.
Maybe I answered my own question on that one.
Yeah. No, it's funny you say that, because I was thinking about Isaiah, whose kind of prophet's journey begins with him confessing, I am unclean and
Dude,
impure and
yes.
unable to be this voice that you are calling me to
Yeah.
be. And
I'm
it's
a
only
man of
through
unclean
God.
lips among a people of
Uh-huh.
unclean lips. Like
Exactly.
I'm guilty by association and by personal commitment. Like,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And it's only God's forgiveness and purification using a hot coal on his mouth that allows him
Yeah.
to be a voice, right? And so I think of Jesus's words that anybody who wants to call out somebody else should first examine the fact that they've got a log in their eye, right?
Yeah.
Before calling out the speck in somebody else's eye. And I think we've done a little bit of self-reflection on this episode here, but I think it's so important, if you want to call out others, that you've got to get your own house in order first, right?
Mm,
We need to be making sure, if we want to speak for the Spirit or allow the Spirit to speak through us, I think we need to make sure that our lives first are exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit.
yeah. It would appear that prophets are very quick to repentance kind of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, all the time. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Paul is like, dude, I suck. I'm the worst of y'all.
Yeah.
All right. Like, he's
I
like,
am
I don't
the
know.
least
Like,
among the
I'm
apostles.
the least,
Yeah.
like, I don't know, like, and I think about that a lot. Elijah, Elisha, like, there's just
Mm.
this like clear radical commitment. Think about Elisha, who just like burned all of his junk. It was like, I'm out.
Yeah.
A radical commitment and a real quick, like, there's just repentance is quick. with the prophets.
Yeah,
Maybe there's an
which I think
exception.
is, I think
Jonah.
that's
That's an exception.
very
But,
true, very
yeah.
true. The unwilling prophet,
Yeah.
which Jonah basically is a joke. It's the whole book is like a
Yes.
comic book. We can have another conversation about that another time, but
Yeah.
it's meant to be very satirical. He's meant to be really different from all the other prophets.
Yep.
Anyway, so I think that earlier you said you kind of have this like almost vibe check where most of the people who claim to be prophets
Hmm.
are people that don't seem very like they should be prophets, and I think that's
Yeah.
what it's all about. If somebody is gleeful to have the opportunity to tear somebody else down, and they're
Oh,
like,
yeah.
and especially if they're doing it on YouTube and getting
Phil in his
millions of
20s,
clicks
man.
and getting
It's a good
paid
thing I
for it.
didn't have a YouTube channel when I was in my
Yeah,
20s. I
yeah,
was an idiot.
like, and feeling so self-righteous, and
Hmm.
there's just a
Hmm.
lack of
Hmm.
repentance. There's a lack of
Yep.
being filled
100%.
with the Spirit, and that is, it might you. It's easy to claim it's prophetic, but it's not from the Lord.
Okay. Random turn. I have no idea if this is helpful, but I had a thought when you were speaking.
Love it.
Dude, is there a pattern? Were prophets people of imagination?
Ooh, 100%. Who was
Like,
the one
right?
that was naked for
Was it Jeremiah,
forever?
right? Wasn't it Jeremiah?
Jeremiah or Ezekiel? Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know. Ezekiel ate bread off of feces.
Well, not just like, but like, what I mean by imagination too is, okay, so think about that moment with Elijah that you were talking about. This is what got me thinking about
Yeah,
it. And
yeah.
you're like, and it took a burning coal on his lips.
Isaiah.
Was that Isaiah? I thought that was, yeah,
Yeah.
you're right, Isaiah. Anyways, okay, but anyways, Isaiah, right? So that didn't happen. It did, but Isaiah was never in the Holy of Holies
Right,
in a sense, right?
right.
He has a vision, you know, and we know that in the text, in the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Well, if you see the Lord, you die, right? So there's all these like hyperlinks in this text that he's
Mm,
having a vision. And that's normal. It's very normal. But the prophets seem like, man, am I drawing like a wrong conclusion? The prophets seem like people of imagination. Like the Lord
mhm.
speaks to them and gives them visions, and they seem to be people who have really large capacity
Yeah.
to imagine what is not actually visible in front of them
We've got a big
viscerally.
imagination bucket that God can fill up.
Yeah, right. I don't know, man. I don't know where that. I don't know if that's valuable at all. If there's a bunch of smarter people out there, studying these things. If this
Mm,
line ends up with anybody, I would love to know more. Is there some indication that prophets are those with a very deep well of imagination that the Spirit gives them and draws from and works within? Um,
I would say yes, 100%.
it feels like it, but I don't want to. I don't want to
Ezekiel.
draw like to be a prophet. You got to have a big imagination. Like I don't know.
Right, right,
You know.
right. But the testimony of the prophets that we have are people who Ezekiel
Oh,
sees himself being taken to the top of the temple and looking down, and he sees a river coming out of the
yeah,
middle of the temple and flowing out and getting wider and deeper. And there's just all
yeah,
these incredible word pictures, and the poetry throughout the prophets is not, it's
yeah,
not just general prose. Like, I had a thought, so I scribbled it down real quick. It's like carefully, artistically, poetically crafted, every
yeah.
word perfectly written. And I think there's something to that. It's a imaginative mind. It's an artistic mind. It's a mind
Mm.
that's open to allow the God of creation and beauty to speak.
It's a mind that can stand in two places at one time. I think that's one of the
Yeah.
beauty. And
Wow, that's
like,
good.
yeah, like some people, like you feel this. Like if you're a daydreamer, I was a daydreamer as a kid, right? Like the ability to like be in a room and be fully present in that room and be somewhere else in your mind,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
your imagination is totally.
Which can be really bad. It can be very unhealthy.
Well,
It can also be
yeah,
a blessing from God.
yeah, it could be. But it feels like there's like, and I don't know. Maybe everyone's gifted that. Some people,
Hmm.
I don't, I just don't know. There's a lot I don't know there. But I wonder, man.
Hmm.
Like these are imaginative people who can be in two places, who can be on Patmos and be in the throne room of God at the same time.
Yeah.
You
And
know?
what else are we called to be other than citizens of the kingdom of heaven while living here on earth,
Yeah.
right? We're, in a sense, we're supposed to be in two places at once,
Yeah.
living as citizens of the sky while living here on the land.
Yeah. And in many ways, and I just want to honor the fact that I know that some people they're not gifted with imagination. And
Mhm.
that sounds offensive, but like there's literally like conditions like where it's hard to imagine what's not concrete in front of you. This is just a part of how God has made different people. And so, and mad respect, because I think some of those individuals who choose to commit to this kingdom that is not yet here, it's a bigger act of faith.
Mm.
Like it really is. Like I just want to honor that. Like there's a genuine, like when Jesus is speaking to Thomas and he's like you believe because you've seen. Blessed
Mm.
are those who come and they don't see. For some of us today, it's not that we've seen in a literal sense like Thomas, but there's a sense like the Lord's gifted us with an imagination where it's not, I think about me and my wife, like it's just not hard for me to imagine a future, like what could be and the possibilities. I'm a romantic optimist. Like I'm pathetic at sometimes, you know what I mean? Like I always think good
Adorable.
things are going to happen. Thank you so much. And I can imagine the future, right? Like what's going to be, I imagine it very viscerally.
Mm.
And that's a blessing at times, and my wife just doesn't quite have that, like for her taking leaps of faith are it's a bigger deal. I have so much more respect for her in that capacity because like when I have a crazy idea and I can envision what this is going to be like, you know what I mean? Like, oh, it's going to be like this. It's going to be great. Um, came home, came home one day from work and I'd been doing woodworking for like, for those who don't know, I build furniture as a hobby. It's fun. And I was really early on in this process. I had like no tools. I had built a crappy desk. Okay. That's like all I had claim to. And I came home one day and I told my wife, I'm going to build a couch. Like literally I went from crappy desk, like very small desk to I'm going to build a 3-person couch, you know? And for me, it was like I could see it, like I could envision how I'm going to do this. I could see myself doing the work. I could visualize it very tangibly. I could feel the tools in my hand. I could be like, and my wife couldn't. She's like, I don't get it. Like I draw little things. She's like, I don't know. Whatever. I don't know what this is gonna look like. And bless her for trusting me to go forth. And I did end up building the couch, which is a very bad couch. Actually, that's the second version of the couch,
My
right there.
imagination is working so well that I can see it. Like I can picture it exactly right
To
now.
all of our YouTube watchers, I'm sorry if
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
on
yeah.
Spotify or Apple. There you
Yeah.
go.
No, I think you're really onto something. I think part of the call to be prophetic is the call to be able to be imaginative. And so if we're
Yeah.
just shouting the talking points that will get our tribe to applaud for us, that does not take a lot of imagination or creativity. It doesn't take the voice of the one that imagined this world into being to be able
Mm,
to shout out tirades against people you don't like.
mm. Recap? I feel like
Yeah.
this needs a recap.
Yeah.
All right. We'll ping
The
pong our
modern day
recap.
prophet.
It's going to
Yeah.
be really terrible. We got this. Okay. So one of my big takeaways, okay, recap here. Prophets are people who speak truth to power in the Lord. They speak the word of the Lord, the truth of the Lord, unto the local power structures for
Mm.
the good of equipping saints to do ministry,
Even when it costs them something.
even when it costs them something.
Yeah.
Mm,
And they are people who allow the Lord to speak through them in all kinds of ways. So it's not limited to one thing or another, but can include poetry or a wild actor portrayal of some symbolic thing that the Lord has
hmm
told you that everybody's going to think you're crazy for. But it can include all kinds of wild, imaginative, creative types of speech or acts.
and it sounds like for those of us who feel like we might have a burden to prophesy, to speak truth to the power structures in our local community, I think a good question to ask ourselves is, do I love this community enough? If I'm risking something, right? Like is this going to be a risk to me? Do I care and value this community enough that this would hurt if it goes south? And do I
Yeah.
love the Lord enough to not stay silent?
And do I
pray that.
value their wholeness above just their acceptance of me?
Yeah.
Mm.
Do I not just care that they are adhering to what I consider proper knowledge or doctrine, but do I care that they are equipped to bring the kingdom of God into the local community? And if those are your cares and concerns and the things that you want to see happen, and you believe that your heart's pure and you've tested the Spirit inside of you, you've removed the log from your eye to the best of your ability, it's time to tell someone, show them the speck in their eye, and to trust the Lord with the consequences. And the consequences could be dire, but consequences of not following the Lord are more so. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Living Room Disciple and for being a Living Room Disciple listener. It's a big deal to allow voices like me and Nick and Kelsey and others into your life to form you, and our prayer and desires that we're helping to form you into being like Jesus. And there's a lot of voices out there claiming authority and the ability to speak prophetically into our lives. So from the Living Room Disciple to you, we're praying for discernment for ourselves and for you, that we will be people who can truly understand how to test the spirits and to do it well. Well, thanks for listening to the episode, and thank you to Micah Pop for all the amazing production work, to Eric Church for getting the episode out into the world, and to Daniel Ramirez who composed our music. And thanks to you for listening through to the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home.